Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at the protocols and the corresponding ports that we need to know for the exam. Okay, there's a number of them, and they all correspond to some layer of the Internet model. So if you recall, there are 7 layers to the OSI model. There are 4 layers that correspond in the Internet model: the application layer, the transport layer, the Internet layer, and then the network layer. So let's go ahead and take a look at the application layer protocols and ports first. And the first one we'll look at is FTP. It stands for File Transfer Protocol, and it is for transferring, as you might guess, files from a client to a server, or vice versa, from a server to a client. It operates TCP on port 20 and 21, and as you recall, TCP is a connection-oriented protocol. So, transferring files, however, the downside to that is that it is not secure. All right, so that information that is communicated, or if someone logs into an FTP server, those credentials are sent in clear text. So that's not a good thing. So basically, we want to make sure that we use FTPS or FTP secure, or block that traffic if it's not really necessary within our environment. Obviously, there are times when people need to be able to access FTP servers. So if that's the case, we want to just make sure that we're aware of what's going on. The next one is FTPS, and that stands for FTP or File Transfer Protocol Secure, or FTP over SSL, depending on where you read. Okay, FTPS rather, operates on TCP ports 989 and 990. And just like FTP, the 2 ports, one are for data and one are for control messages. And basically, again, it's a secure file transfer method. All right, so it uses SSL, or Secure Sockets Layer, for encryption. Now, encryption can be turned off if another encryption method is in use. So in other words, if we're using IPsec or we're using some other method to secure our communication from client to server, then you may not need the encryption component of FTPS, so that can be turned off. So just to keep that in mind, if we have the option of using a secure method of doing something, then as a security conscious individual, as a security admin, you want to look for those opportunities, turn off the ports, turn off the protocols that we don't need, and use their secure equivalents. Okay, the next one is SSH and SCP, and that is Secure Shell or Secure Copy. And SSH uses TCP port 22, and it is a way to log in remotely to remote devices, routers, switches, servers, storage arrays, things along those lines. Okay, so a lot of different types of devices can be logged into via SSH, and it is just a secure way of accessing those devices. Okay, Telnet, which is the next one here, is an equivalent of that, or something similar, but it's not secure. Okay, again, sent in plain text. So SSH again uses TCP port 22. SCP, or Secure Copy, also uses SSH to securely transfer files, much like FTPS. However, SCP is an unattended protocol, so we can basically script that, and there's no real GUI like you would have in an FTP session, whether it's from the command line or from some type of graphical interface. SCP allows us to do things programmatically. Okay, the next one is Telnet, and as I mentioned, Telnet is very similar to SSH in the fact that we can remotely configure devices, routers, switches, other PCs, servers, things along those lines. However, Telnet is an insecure protocol. So disable if possible. Okay, it goes over TC port 23, and it sends information clear text. So again, it's really a bad practice, especially if we're trying to communicate to servers or things outside of our internal network. It's also open to traffic sniffers, so things like network monitors, Wireshark, so on and so forth. Okay, next is SMTP, or Simple Mail Transport Protocol, and SMTP operates over TCP port 25, and what it basically is a delivery protocol or delivery mechanism, server to server, for our email. So it allows, or is the communication protocol that servers use to transfer email from server to server. Then at the client level, when you or I fire up our PC or our laptop and we connect to our mail server, we use then either POP, which is port 110, or IMAP, which is port 143. Now again, some security considerations. With SMTP, there is no encryption inherent in the protocol itself. Okay, that's handled, again, at the upper layers if we want to add some type of encryption. If we want to use IPsec or something along those lines, there are ways to encrypt the communication itself. But just keep in mind that SMTP, the protocol itself, contains no encryption. There's no security mechanisms built in. So you should either use something like SMIME or Secure MIME, or PGP, which stands for Pretty Good Privacy. There are methods to encrypt the email itself. So one other security consideration to keep in mind is that we should disable the SMTP open relay feature, because by default, our mail servers and a lot of implementations will have SMTP relay turned on. And if that's the case, then spammers, they love when they find a mail server that has the relay capabilities turned on, because then they'll just start flooding spam email through those servers, okay? Because that way it looks like it's coming from that server instead of the spammer's originating server. So definitely turn off SMTP open relay feature, and that will limit spam attacks and also relay attacks. Okay, next is DNS, or the Domain Name System, and DNS operates on UDP port 53. And DNS, as you may be aware, is the Domain Name System, and what it's responsible for is resolving URLs, or web addresses, to IP addresses. So in other words, if you typed in www.pluralsight.com as an example, it would resolve that from the domain name to an IP address, because as you may or may not be aware, computers do not communicate via the human readable or the human friendly names that we come to memorize and we all know. So what it does is it converts that, or translates that web address to an IP address. Some security considerations with DNS is to understand that a fairly insecure mechanism, if not tightened down and configured properly, and that it's open to or vulnerable to DNS poisoning, which is basically having a DNS server injecting records into a DNS server to have it point somewhere else. So it thinks it's directing you to, let's say, a legitimate server, when in fact it's actually directing you to a malicious web server that's designed to look just like the real thing. So that way when you get there, you either input credentials, or you'll start to browse and get misinformation, or they will load that web server up with malware, spyware, and so forth that will download to your machine. Additionally, DNS can be spoofed with phishing attacks. So when you have a phishing email, as an example, it'll say go here, and they may mask the URL in the email or the image, so you think you're going to a legitimate website, but the domain name is just changed just slightly, or it's tweaked just enough so that you're actually going to a different server, again made to look like the legitimate web server. When that happens, it's typically going to prompt you for login credentials. Once you do that and you put in your username and password, then they capture that information, and then they may time out and bomb and say, hey, the web server's down or something. So you think that you logged in, but you didn't get to where you wanted to go, and you're just going about your business. When in reality, what they've done is captured your login information. Now that they have that, they can basically go to the real site as you and access information, banking information, whatever it is that you were trying to get to. They now have your credentials and can do the same thing. Okay, the next one is Trivial FTP, or TFTP. And Trivial File Transfer Protocol is a UDP protocol over port 69, and it was originally used or created for network boots, so basically booting up over the network, or PXE environments. Pre-boot execution environments, or the PXE environment, allows a workstation with no actual operating system on it itself to boot up and attach to a network. Security considerations: no authentication or encryption. And it's also designed for anonymous connections. Again, we're allowing things to boot up to the network and either download an OS or download enough of a boot image to boot onto the network. So unless there is some need to have TFTP turned on in your environment, it should be disabled wherever possible. Next, we have HTTP, which you should be familiar with, Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And the Hypertext Transfer Protocol is a TCP transport mechanism over port 80. And it's used to access web pages, as we're all more than likely familiar with. However, whether you know it or not, HTTP is an insecure protocol. Again, no encryption, no authentication. Things are sent in clear text. So when you visit a website that requires you to log in, especially things of any type of financial nature or anything that would contain sensitive information, you should make sure that you're operating over a secure connection. Okay, HTTPS, which is our next one. All right, so security considerations for HTTP. Again, no encryption or authentication. It is vulnerable to sniffers. It's vulnerable to header injection, replay, and man-in-the-middle attacks. So someone can basically sniff the wire, understand your IP address or the actual packets that are in transmission, kind of hijack that session, so to speak, jump in the middle of it, and then from that point forward, they can assume your identity or your connection and then access that web server as you. All right, so that's why we need to go wherever possible when we're dealing with secure or sensitive information is HTTPS, which is Hypertext Transfer Protocol Secure, or HTTP over SSL. So it's used for securely accessing web pages, as we know. Okay, it's certificate based. The secure web servers that we visit will have a certificate issued to them by one of the large certificate issuing bodies out on the internet, who in turn issue certificates that everyone imports at a very high level and trusts. So we have certificates on our computer, or certificate authorities rather, that we trust. So when we have certificates issued by those issuing authorities, then we automatically trust or secure that connection. Okay, so it's used for securely accessing web pages, typically again for e-commerce, for financial institutions, things along those lines. However, a lot of websites are now using HTTPS to secure their communication. Google, Gmail, most of your internet-based mail servers, Facebook, a lot of the social media type of websites, they're all using HTTPS now. Or if they're not, there's typically an option to enable it by default. All right, so that way it secures your communication, because as we know, a lot of people access these services from coffee shops, from airports, from insecure locations. And if you're not careful, it's very easy for someone to sit with the proper tools in those locations, coffee shops, airports, and so on, and sniff the traffic, gain your credentials, and then access the websites as you. Okay, in other words, basically hijack your connections. So whenever possible, we want to use SSL or TLS for security. Now, some security considerations when dealing with HTTPS is it's only as strong as the TLS or SSL underneath. Okay, so we have to make sure that we understand that just because it says HTTPS doesn't mean it's completely uncrackable. Okay, those things have in fact been cracked. We thought for quite a while that it wasn't crackable, but we've had instances in the past where certificates have been compromised. Okay, the certificate authorities have been hacked, and so therefore the certificates that they issue were at risk or compromised. There was a situation known as Heartbleed that basically rendered a lot of websites and a lot of web servers vulnerable. One of the most significant security breaches really in the history of communication on the internet. So a lot of websites or web servers that were supposedly secure were in fact vulnerable to that bug. Okay, SSL and TLS itself doesn't actually have a port number assigned to it. It depends upon what communication protocol that it rides on top of. But in this case, we're using port 443 because we're dealing with HTTPS. So again, Secure Sockets Layer is the older implementation. TLS, or Transport Layer Security, is the newer version based on SSL. So they can be used interchangeably, however, they're not directly compatible. So you're going to basically have one or the other when you're securing your HTTP connection. Security considerations, we're going to add confidentiality and data integrity, and it encapsulates other protocols. As I said, it's used to basically secure HTTP traffic in this instance. And it instates a stateful session with a handshake. So that prevents, or negates, I should say, most of the chance of someone coming in and basically injecting in the middle of that session. All right, because we have to have a handshake on both sides. And then last but not least, make sure that all of your servers in your environment are patched for the Heartbleed bug. Again, very serious security flaw, or security hole, I should say, on web servers pretty much around the globe. So definitely make sure that those servers, if you have web servers in your environment, make sure they're patched.